1945. World War II ends, and Allied powers must decide how to deal with Ho Chi Minh's nationalist movement in Vietnam. Then, France goes to war against Ho's forces in an effort to regain its former colony. The United States sees the fight as part of the emerging Cold War against the Soviet Union and provides France with financial support. 1950. The U.S. commits a few dozen advisors to the French in their war against the Viet Minh and agrees to pay half the cost. 1954. 40,000 Viet Minh lay siege to the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu and block resupply of the post. In the end, the French lose the fight. Meanwhile, President Dwight Eisenhower likens the events in Southeast Asia to a falling domino process. If one country should fall to communism, he argues, bordering countries would follow in rapid succession. Later that year, Geneva Accords outlining a ceasefire and the division of Vietnam until nationwide elections take place are signed by French and Viet Minh military leaders. The U.S. doesn't sign the pact, but agrees to abide by it. 1956. After 11 years of fighting, the French leave Vietnam. The U.S. steps in with military advisors to help train South Vietnamese forces. 1961. John F. Kennedy takes office and expands U.S. involvement in Vietnam, calling it the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia. 1963. President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in and vows he's not going to lose Vietnam. 1964. In the wake of alleged attacks on U.S. Navy ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, Congress grants President Johnson the power to commit U.S. forces to turn back the North Vietnamese. 1965. By the end of the year, 185,000 American troops serve in Vietnam.
For nearly 20 years, America's participation in events in Vietnam was one of support. But once the French gave up the fight, the U.S. gradually took on a more active role. In the end, nearly 3.5 million American men and women played a part. In the next half hour, we look back at the Vietnam War through the stories of a group of Marine Corps officers who came to the Corps during one of the most turbulent and troubled times in America's history.
U.S. soldier to South Vietnam in the Vietnam.
Virginia, November 1967. The basic school at Marine Corps Base Quantico begins teaching the latest batch of newly commissioned officers what it means to be an officer in the Marine Corps.
I'm sure some of us were motivated to join the Marine Corps because we would have been drafted, but no, none of us were drafted into the Marine Corps. We were all volunteers. Despite all you hear, I think most of us were quite anxious to get involved and to do our part.
Looking back, I think that was before the media, the real media frenzy started, and before Walter Cronkite announced to the world that we'd lost the war, because it was prior to TET. It was prior to Quezon.
But those events are on the immediate horizon. In January, as the men of TBS Class 568 continue their second month of training, unexpected critics of the war begin to surface. Just across the Potomac at a White House conference on crime, singer and actress Eartha Kitt denounces the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, more than 8,000 miles away, the North Vietnamese Army lays siege to the remote Marine Corps outpost at Quezon. Just days later, the North launches the countrywide Tet Offensive, with 80,000 troops striking at more than 100 towns and cities, taking Allied forces by surprise. And even as the bullets and bombs wreak havoc in Vietnam, in the U.S., more war protesters gather, using words as their weapons.
I think that all of us were aware of what was going on, but we were pretty well focused on what we were doing at the time.
Quint Wortham's commission followed 2 years of service in the Corps' enlisted ranks, all during a time when the integration of African Americans into a broader range of American society was happening. And though U.S. military leaders touted equality within the services, discrimination was still an issue.
There was some. However, I think that for the most part, those of us who were in OCS were more enlightened. I saw more of it when I was an enlisted man.
As training continues for Quint and his classmates, news of other major events filters in. In February, anti-war sentiment grows as Americans react to the Associated Press photograph of Saigon's police chief executing a Viet Cong prisoner. Then President Johnson announces he will not seek re-election. In April, as graduation nears, they learn of a tragic loss in Memphis, Tennessee.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
I was with 3 other officers coming back from D.C. when we heard on the radio that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And that was very upsetting to me because I knew what would happen in this country. You know, I knew the explosion that would cause.
The base chaplain came in and addressed our class. The topic of the sermon was a man was killed today. And that man will be buried shortly, and this country will go on. And I thought in some respects he was trivializing the death of a great man, a man who we didn't really fully appreciate until some years later.
While the country mourns, word arrives that the siege of Khe Sanh has finally been lifted, although both sides claim victory. 2 days later, the classmates reach their goal, graduation. Additional specialized job training is planned for most. Then, Vietnam.
divisions that exist so deeply within our country and remove the stain of bloodshed.
In the summer of 1968, social unrest could be seen and felt across the United States. The shock of the Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy assassinations was still fresh.
If you do not leave, you will be subject to arrest.
And there was a growing fear for loved ones fighting a war the majority of Americans were now against. In the midst of it all, thousands of service members, including many graduates of Marine Corps Basic School Class 568, prepared to go join the fight.
On my way to Vietnam, I was in San Francisco airport, and because I had gold bars on, there was a group approaching me that had protest signs, and they surrounded me. And there were quite a few people, and there were chants, and there were some taunts. But as I stood there and acknowledged the people who were doing what they're doing, in my heart, I knew that their right to do that was because there were people like me willing to stand in harm's way.
Second Lieutenant Lar Litster arrived in Vietnam in July and soon found himself in command of an infantry platoon.
Doing search and destroy missions on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, if they weren't wearing Marine Corps green or they weren't mountain yards, our objective was to kill them. That was our job.
the enemy forces had the same objective.
There's a very distinctive sound that goes with mortars that echoes through the valleys and the canyons and up across the hills. Thoop, 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 thoop. And you knew that soon there would be explosions.
When only 2 months into his tour, an enemy mortar found its mark.
I was in a bomb crater with my platoon, and the enemy landed the mortar round underneath me. As I came back to consciousness, the first question, of course, I cried out was to my men, was anyone else hit? And I remember one of the corporals said, "Sir, we've all been hit."
And Lahr vividly recalls another corporal's actions that he says really speaks to who Marines are.
Several times, this one corporal, whose name was Newbold, Corporal Newbold, kept coming to my side, and I would try to get up, especially when we would get new incoming rounds of mortars. And I tried to get up, and Newbold pushed me down, and then he laid across my body, and I said to him, "Newbold, go take cover." I could barely whisper. I remember Newbold saying to me, "No, sir, I'm staying here. You can't take another hit."
By the end of 1968, nearly 17,000 more Americans have died in Vietnam. Meanwhile, those carrying on the fight hear little news about the war's overall progress. They go about their missions focused on the job at hand.
When we're there, see, you don't know the overall picture, you just know the ground in front of you. So what people reported and how they put it together, didn't really see a whole lot.
You know, we didn't have the type of outside world communications they have now. Most of what you heard was just what I'll call the everyday bitching and moaning, you know, that we all do. For the most part, more concerned about, you know, was there something decent to eat, or was it possible to get clean, or, you know, things of that type.
At the same time, the American public doesn't always hear about the many good things happening in the midst of the war.
The terrible things you hear about the war, they're the exception. We were involved in building schools and doing a lot of other things in civic action in Vietnam that you hear so little about.
That second tour, all I did was work with civilians, and we built schools and dispensaries. I helped the Marines adopt orphans out of the 3 orphanages there, and it was a great experience.
Do solemnly swear.
January 1969. Richard Nixon takes office as the new President of the United States. Regarding Vietnam, he aims to negotiate a settlement that will allow the 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam to be withdrawn, while still allowing South Vietnam to survive.
I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
Soon after, all hear the sobering news that U.S. combat deaths in Vietnam have exceeded the 33,629 men killed in the Korean War, a toll that now includes 8 of the 241 graduates of Marine Basic School Class 568, Quint Wortham's classmates.
When I heard that Ron Davidson had been killed and Bill Jones had been killed and John Abbott had been killed, it was a wake-up call for me, because I knew that if they could kill those guys, they could kill me too.
At the time, Lieutenant Worthams was serving in Vietnam as a communications officer, in a command position unusual in those times of continued racial strife.
In my case, I know there was no place else in the continental United States, or perhaps even in the world, where a black man could have 65 people reporting to him at 22 years old. And was it an issue being a black officer in command of a white platoon? No, I didn't allow it to become one.
November 1969. The American public is shocked and appalled by reports of a massacre at My Lai. Photos show the bodies of hundreds of Vietnamese civilians, men, women, and children, brutally murdered. And the reports say American soldiers are to blame. Soon, there are greater demands to get out of Vietnam. A new year begins. While the battle to end U.S. involvement in Vietnam goes on at home, On a hilltop in Vietnam, Lieutenant Ed Flanagan is serving as a forward air controller.
And a lot of Purple Hearts are your own fault, and in this case it was, because we were in a safe bunker, and I thought if during the mortar attack, if I could look outside and see where that muzzle flash was, I could run an airstrike on it, and a mortar round came. And it was a head injury, but with a head injury, you bleed a lot, even though it isn't that serious. But I was really convinced that I was going to be dead soon. Spent the night in the bunker, and in the morning, called in my own medevac. That was in October, and I was due to rotate in November. And I thought, well, I'm good now. I can just take it easy, and left the hospital and wound up back on the same hill. And I really didn't want to be there anymore. I just wanted to go home.
2 weeks later, Ed got his wish. And over the next year, the majority of the U.S. combat troops in Vietnam followed. By January 1972, only 133,000 remained. In December, peace talks between the U.S. and North Vietnam break down. President Nixon orders the most intense bombing campaign of the war, targeting North Vietnamese factories and ports. Over 12 days, U.S. aircraft dropped more than 20,000 tons of bombs. 1 month later, peace talks resume, and soon after, President Nixon signs the ceasefire agreement ending U.S. military involvement in Vietnam.
And where do we go from here?
On March 29, 1973, the last American combat soldiers leave. South Vietnam must now fend for itself.
That caused an emotional turmoil in me like nothing I'd ever experienced in my life. And I knew many, many of us who, if they would have said, get your stuff and go back over there, we're not going to let this happen, I know we'd have gone in a minute.
We embrace them and say, we'll work with you to achieve this result. And then when things become difficult, we say, well, we're leaving.
As a civil affairs officer, I had 53 Vietnamese employees working for me too. So I was equally concerned about all of those people because I knew what would be done to those people that had fought with us for their freedom.
March 29th also saw the last of the known 591 American POWs leave Hanoi. The men are flown to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines and are greeted with cheers. For many Americans, their return marked the final chapter in our country's involvement in the Vietnam War. For others, later events would come to signify the true end.
To fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress.
August 1974, South Vietnam loses a strong advocate as President Richard Nixon resigns. Over the next 7 months, North Vietnamese forces make stunning gains in the south. Without American military aid, the Saigon government is unable to fend off attacks from the north. Then, news of North Vietnamese forces at Saigon city gates triggers a U.S. military evacuation of American citizens and members of the press in the city. But word of the effort leaks, and rescue teams find themselves swarmed by thousands of desperate Vietnamese seeking escape. During the operation's 24 chaotic hours, nearly 1,400 U.S. citizens and 5,600 Vietnamese and third country nationals are lifted to U.S. Navy ships offshore. Only a few hours later, North Vietnamese tanks roll into Saigon. After so many years and so many deaths, on April 30th, 1975, the fight for a free Vietnam is truly lost.
And 10 years later, on the anniversary, when the media spent an entire month focusing on the fall of Saigon, that drove me into counseling.
For Jim Horn and countless other veterans of the Vietnam War, there were many more battles after their return home. Some were shunned by their fellow Americans. Others struggled to restart their lives with damaged bodies and minds. Nearly all had to find a way to cope with memories of war and friends lost in battle. For many veterans of the Vietnam War, the memories still cause pain. Some relive battles and injuries they suffered. Others recall the loss of close friends. Regardless of the cause, many find comfort in the one location that has come to embody the Vietnam War experience.
It was very difficult for me, and I had PTSD, still have it. And after 30 years, in '99, I came here. It was an October morning, and I was the only one here. As I came down, the sun was coming up over the Capitol, and I could see the clouds and the pink from the rising sun on the scalloped clouds, and it was just a remarkable setting. As I walked down to the wall and found the names of my comrades and touched them, what I got was that all 58,000 of them were at peace, and they were okay. It was us who weren't. And my concern, of course, had been for them. Very cathartic experience.
Almost 10 years later, Lahr returned to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. for a second visit, along with many other graduates of the basic school class 568.
40 years ago, we first assembled ourselves. Marine Corps officer candidates turned Marine Corps basic school graduates. We became TBS class 5-68, all 241 of us. And now we're assembled again, a goodly number of us, this time to pay our respects to those members of our class who are no longer with us. We're standing in front of the names of 8 members of TBS class 568 and in front of the names of thousands of others from that same conflict. We've come to honor our fallen classmates. They were and they are Marine officers, every one.
No matter how many people are here, there's just a presence, and it's just an awesome thing. And having the widows, having the children of the deceased here with us just made it even more special, because we were honoring them as well as their husbands that had died.
58,000 names are inscribed on the wall behind us. Some of those, the names of your classmates. In the poem titled "The Wall," written by Tim Murphy, he describes it this way, which I think brings it to light to those of you who knew these men. It goes like this: and every name's a father or a husband or a son, or a daughter or a brother or a cousin to someone, or a name might be a classmate or a friend you may recall. There's nearly 60,000 fallen names still wailing at the wall. They had the world before them, and here they were, Marines, ready and willing to fight for freedom and for one another. Every one of them, a patriot, a hero, a Marine. And so are you. So are you.
This ceremony at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was the final event for TBS Class 568's first reunion since their graduation in 1968. The reunion was a chance to renew old friendships.
I can tell you this is a momentous event in my life. I've never experienced anything like these last 4 days. It's a brotherhood that surpasses any and everything that I've ever experienced in my life.
It means a lot. I don't think I realized how much. Because it's not that they're all the closest friends you ever had or this or that, but there's something you share. And maybe you haven't thought about it in a long time.
Their reunion offered a chance to reflect and honor lost friends.
Being able to see those names and etch those names, touch those names, means a lot of different things to different people, but I think it's phenomenal. It's what we need.
And gave these Vietnam veterans a chance to let all the fallen know.
Somebody still cares. That, they're not forgotten.
The Vietnam War came at a time when Americans were already dealing with so much internal conflict and change. And it was a long, bloody fight with an end that left veterans of the war and families of those who fell without a victory to help ease their pain and loss. Bob McSweeney's words from a few moments ago sum up the message both groups wish for, that we remember those who fought, those who fell, and show that somebody does still care. I'm Sergeant Brian Buckwalter. This has been Recon.